My name is Gavin Sullivan. I'm a professor of social and political psychology in the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and my great read today is Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The Investigations was published in 1953 after Wittgenstein's death in 1951. This is one version of the Investigations. A more recent one, looking far heftier, with very many more edits and comments, comes from Peter Hacker and Joachim Schulte, more recently published. I prefer this one because it's got all my notes on Wittgenstein's work, and it helps me to kind of remind me of why it's such a great work. And there's so many useful comments through this, ranging from what philosophy is, how philosophy is relevant to practices such as mathematics and philosophy, and even helped me, especially during my PhD work, to understand the concepts of reflexivity, so being self-critical in the psychological or human sciences and the social sciences. And it also helped me to understand and map some of the issues around pride, some of the conceptual issues. Just a little note too, I'm using the wonder of 4K 360 degree video to record this, so at any time you can scroll around, hopefully, the garden and look at something else other than me, or you could look down at the various books I've collected here that were inspired by and relate to Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. So before I get into kind of exactly why Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations was great for me, I think it's important to mention also that Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations is of particular interest to me because of this book also, Wittgenstein's On Certainty, Übergewissheit. And one of the intriguing things about Wittgenstein is just that his writing has had such resonance for people in philosophy and other practices after his death. So many of his published works were actually put together by executors of his will, and these notes were not made available during his lifetime, so he was not around to defend these and present these ideas. But he also realized with his impending death from prostate cancer in 1951 that he was not able to do justice to his work in any polished final sense. So we have his notes, and we have manuscripts such as the Philosophical Investigations that weren't published during his lifetime. And this one I'm mentioning, On Certainty, is really a wonderful piece of work that I think is disregarded, and it flows on from his comments and remarks and the voluminous notes he wrote in the Philosophical Investigations. Okay. So, Philosophical Investigations, why is it great particularly? And then I'll talk a little about uncertainty, because that's really a very cool way of seeing how Wittgenstein continued his work from the Philosophical Investigations, looking at issues of what certainty is in everyday life, what counts as knowledge, in ways that are a little surprising given his treatment in the Philosophical Investigations. So the Philosophical Investigations, a great book because I think it redefines what philosophy is, and redefines its relevance to practices such as mathematics and psychology. So Wittgenstein makes it very clear that philosophy should not be like science at all. It shouldn't be theorizing, although it can be very abstract in its ideas and its concepts, so concepts such as language games or forms of life. These concepts can be abstract, but they're used ultimately to reinforce the value of looking at the detail of everyday language and how everyday language is intertwined with practice and practical foundations for our activities as humans. And so this shows us how sense is then created through human activity, but also is limited by our surroundings and material features of our lives and features of our biology. So how does he do that? And firstly, he tells us that philosophy should not be about constructing theories. It's not like science. If anything, it's gaining an overview or an understanding of concepts. So if you find yourself, say as a social scientist, for example, trying to find a theory of psychology from Wittgenstein's work, you're approaching it in the wrong way. What he's trying to do is what he calls disentangle knots in our thinking. And sometimes they're informed by the language we use itself. The fact that pictures are often intertwined with the ways we describe our activities and their significance to us. And so one of the good examples of this is what's called the private language argument. And the private language argument is dealt with in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. It's in a section which talks about, can a person have a language that only they understand and only they use? And this has been really a crucial piece of work. It helps to understand many of the conceptual problems of contemporary psychology. But when you engage with it, you can also see why approaches that say that all psychological functioning or psychological experience is public rather than private, so from social constructionists, for example, you can understand why that's actually really misrepresentation of Wittgenstein's views. So if you read this and think he's endorsing social constructionism, you're wrong, and if you read it and think he's endorsing discourse analysis, you're also wrong. Now, why would I say that? Well, because I wrote this particular book, which was published in 2018, which explains Wittgenstein's philosophy in psychology, how it can be used and also its limits. And I go through many issues, firstly, which are about how psychology can engage with philosophy, and those ideas are an interpretation and application of much of the first part of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So that arises from my PhD, which I finished in 2000 in New Zealand, and that's part one, which is reflexivity in psychology and how it connects with philosophy, particularly as it's outlined in the philosophical investigations, and then also in uncertainty. So this shows how inspiring Wittgenstein's work can be, but of course also Wittgenstein's work also has its limits, so it's crucial to be critical of such a source. And that is part two, where I applied the ideas from Wittgenstein's approach, where you try to gain an overview or an Übersicht of the variety of uses of a concept, something even specific as pride, the psychological concept of pride, particularly looking at what's called its grammar. So this is what Wittgenstein inspires us to do, to really look and see how language is used. And he does this in the philosophical investigations mainly via notes in the second part of the philosophical investigation. So the first part, extremely influential and basically in pulling apart what philosophy is and telling you not to create theories and to go out and look and try not to be a professional philosopher. And so the second part really shows how when you're looking at issues such as, can I have a private language? What does it mean to follow a rule? When I'm talking about psychological experiences, am I referring to something private that only I know? All of these he works through and disentangles and shows how you can approach them correctly if you get a very clear sense of how language is actually used. So that is what is called a grammatical approach. That has been hugely influential. It's been misunderstood by many in practices such as psychology. It's been misinterpreted in the social sciences. Perhaps, though, to finish off, I mean, it's a hugely influential work. It's been hugely influential in my life and work. But one of the things also I could say about Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations in relevance to the global crisis at the moment and the response is it's crucial to indicate context. So context is everything for Wittgenstein. That's crucial. Not only the language games we use and how language shifts over time, and meanings shift, and these are not just our own experiences of meaning, but are very much tied to use and how the context may change the use. But also we see that the conventions of communities change, and this changes meaning as well. So with the pandemic, obviously, social distancing introduces norms that change radically our forms of life. Can we change maybe our action tendencies to want to be together? It seems not, by recent protests and other examples of raves in the UK over the last few days. It seems that we still have these inclinations to be together. And that's a product not only of our communal activities, but also what are called in Wittgenstein's work form of life issues. So I think this is one thing that's really crucial in Wittgenstein's work, to understand what form of life is. It's evoking the interrelations between the context we live in, the broader histories that we enact in our communal relations, and it shows that when we change these for reasons such as a pandemic threat, that this also changes our experiences and can also give us a sense that the world has changed completely, that we have a before and after the pandemic, just as we may have had before and after Brexit, for example. So Wittgenstein is alive to these possibilities that we might feel that the world is now completely different because of changes that are external to us, or also that we need to take into account in conventional or normative terms. And maybe a last point as well is that Wittgenstein is not the kind of philosopher, unlike Bertrand Russell, who was his kind of mentor at one stage until Wittgenstein rejected Russell. Wittgenstein is not one of these philosophers to tell you what to do. He doesn't come up with an ethical theory that says you must engage in this political activity, you must work on the right or the left for this or that idea of progress. Rather, in the end, he focuses on improving oneself and working on oneself, and that seems to be a consistent thread throughout his philosophy. And so, I mean, literally that was for him about protecting himself from the personal pride, the vanity, if you like, of thinking of himself as the world's greatest philosopher. So he occasionally caught himself doing this and found the need to challenge that. It's interesting that he worked on himself and wasn't encouraging people to engage in one or more type of political activity. I guess he wasn't even, in a way, an advocate for a particular philosophical approach. In fact, he would have probably been horrified by the fact that my work, for example, has been inspired by his. But I wouldn't also call myself a follower of Wittgenstein, and I think it's that kind of criticality he really encourages in his work. So I think, referring to context, that's crucial. You see here, it's me in a garden. You're surrounded by life. You're surrounded by Dr. Bandicoot, Mr. Pointy the cat, but also what I'm talking about now, the meaning of my words reflects a great deal of communal and personal history, and that, I think, is what Wittgenstein's work helps us to provide insights into. And so, yeah, a hugely influential book, a great read. I recommend reading it and forming your own ideas, trying to approach some traditional topics you've examined in a new way. And then, after you've read that, and you think you have an idea of how Wittgenstein's philosophy works, then have a look at Uncertainty, because it's really a wonderful resource, and I think completely underused in philosophy, in the social sciences, and even in psychology. So that's my great read. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you do read Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, also Uncertainty, any of the other books as well, going back to even the first book of Wittgenstein's from after the First World War, Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And just before I forget, also if you want more detail about Wittgenstein's life, the intertwining of Wittgenstein's work and his philosophy, Ray Monk's The Duty of Genius is really wonderful guide not only to the philosophy and how it works and how it changed over time radically, dramatically. It's also really great read to give an insight into the genius of Wittgenstein. Thank you.